There's a reason that we're drawn to data, I think, which is that we want to make the right choices. That particularly in parenting, we really want to be right. And we feel like data is like a concrete thing to like hang on to.
David Yoakum here. What does running a family and running a business have in common? A lot more than you might think, or at least it should. Today we're joined by Emily Oster, an economics professor at Brown University and best-selling author of 3 books about pregnancy and parenting, Expecting Better, Crib Sheet, and most recently, and the subject of this episode, The Family Firm, a data-driven guide to better decision-making in the early school years. I talk with Emily about the 4 F's to parental decision-making. It turns out F-it is not one of them. And in general, how thinking like a business firm can help improve and even simplify how you manage your family. We apply it to examples like COVID masking, TV and social media, redshirting. We explore limitations and connections to public policy. I try to shame the research community into conducting more randomized experiments. We even talk about witches. Let the record show from when my boys complained to HR that it was Emily who seeded the idea in my mind of a parental syllabus. Welcome to 30,000 Leagues. Welcome, everyone. We have started the Zoom recording, but for some reason it takes a couple of minutes for everybody to literally log in through the internet tube. So I've been instructed to wait about 20 seconds before we get going. So Emily, you and I can just stare at each other awkwardly for a couple of seconds.
It's my favorite.
Yes.
Love a good awkward stare.
Emily, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about the book. But I actually want to start by asking you a question about witches.
Okay.
Which I didn't really know. I didn't really know this about you, but looking back at your CV, I noticed that one of your first papers you shipped, I think you were still in grad school, was about witchcraft and the relation of how weather affects economic conditions, affects witchcraft. If you're able to like dust off the memory banks of your brain, I'm curious the gist of that and how, if at all, it makes you think about sort of political polarization and things today.
So I wrote that paper, just to be clear, I wrote that paper as actually in an undergraduate class about witches. So Harvard has a folklore and mythology department, and I took this class in my senior year about witches. This is like a history of witches. I don't really remember, but there was a paper requirement. I wrote this paper, and the sort of analysis in the paper looks at sort of across locations over like by decade. I put together a bunch of secondary data on like number of witch trials and weather. And so the idea in the paper is to sort of make an argument, make a quantitative version of an argument that I think people had sort of qualitatively suggested, which was that one of the reasons that sometimes you had witch trials were that, there was a crop failure and people wanted someone to blame, and there's like reasons for that. And so I kind of ran these regressions where I showed that like when the weather was worse, when it was colder, there were more witch trials. This sort of overlaps in time period with a period called Little Ice Age, when Europe was somewhat colder. First, it was like a sort of period of cold snaps. So that was kind of the argument in the paper. And I think the idea is that there's a sort of, I'm not sure I'd connect it to political polarization as much as just some kind of like scapegoating, with the idea that, when things go wrong and you don't really understand them, you kind of want to have someone to blame. And then there were the witches to do that with. There you go.
Very nice. I'm impressed you remember the details there.
Absolutely.
That is the kind of connection I had in mind, though, of in a moment of a lot of uncertainty and economic pain and things like that, a kind of slippage into, blaming other folks or getting mad at other folks is, to my mind, a lot of what drives political polarization, actually.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think in that case, there's also a sort of, and people have sort of kind of made this connection to some of this kind of scapegoating in a more modern period. But there was also a thing where, like, if you kill somebody, then you have to feed them. So in a sort of time of crop shortages, there's actually practical reasons, which of course is separate from what we have now. But yeah, I do think there's like, when you don't understand things or you're frustrated or there's a lot of uncertainty, there is a sort of like who's the scapegoating, like who's trying to find someone to blame.
Well, so now we've covered witches, we can turn to the sorcery that is parenting. And yes, of course, some of the best students in the room will have already read the book, even though it's been out for a couple of weeks. But let's assume that some of our listeners haven't had a chance to do that yet and give them a quick cliff notes, although mostly I want to ask some questions about things kind of around the book or beyond the book.
Yeah.
But I wonder if I might prime you to, maybe open with just a little bit on what the analogy of a family firm means, why you kind of pick that imagery.
Sure. Yeah. So when I sort of my last so the book I wrote before this is about, it's called Crib Sheet. It's about kind of parenting in the sort of infancy to age three realm. And when I thought about kind of extending the time scale to this older kid parenting space, there I kind of realized that the way that I was using data and the kinds of things that I was sort of doing, the kinds of ways I was using my job in this era of parenting were a bit different, for kind of two reasons. One, it's actually much less frequently the case that any particular piece of data is very well matched to the question that you're asking or is exactly the answer, right? So I think the analogy I have is like when you have a baby, people often ask, like, is swaddling a good idea? Is swaddling going to make my kid sleep better? That's like a very specific, concrete question. It has an answer. The answer is yes. It's not exactly as effective for all babies, but it's basically like pretty consistently effective across a wide range of baby types. When you turn into a question like, what's the right school for my kid? That is a question that is just totally different for different families. The choice sets you're going to have are different. The opportunities you're going to have are different. That your kids are different. What's going to work for your kids are different. Like all of these pieces are kind of different. So there's no, even if you had sort of very good data, which we don't always, even if you had very good data, it's not clear that the same data would be kind of relevant for everybody. So the data becomes kind of a piece of this book, and there's a bunch of data in the book, which I hope we can talk about a bit. But the whole first part here is really a sort of taking a step back and saying, you're about to enter, or you have entered an era of parenting, a time period of parenting in which there are going to be a ton of logistics and there are going to be a ton of unexpected decisions. And what you're going to need is a way to kind of manage those logistics, to craft a life that you want, to craft a sort of structure of life that you want. And you're going to need a way to make those decisions that means that you're making them well, and not, making them haphazardly. So there's a sort of whole first part of the book, which is centered around the idea that you can take some tools into doing those things, for making that work. You can take some tools from firms. And I sort of talk through some approaches to that. And then I talk some about the data. I will say sort of one piece, which is when you tell people, this book is about how to run your family like a firm, their first thing is like, oh, okay, like this is about using spreadsheets to like optimize your kid and treat your kid like they're a profit, like you're profit maximizing your kid, and like that's the analogy, right? And I think in some ways the book is almost the opposite of that. It's the piece I'm trying to pull from firms is the idea that your decision making should be intentional or deliberate, and that the choices we make are important enough that they deserve thought, and that we should structure our kind of thinking about our families in an intentional way. And I think, in fact, for many families, the result of that may actually be doing less and not more. So in some sense, it's not, use spreadsheets to schedule more soccer practice. It's like use intentionality to decide like soccer's not for you. And actually you just like want to like hang out and go, hang out as a family on the weekends and not do that stuff. So I think it's really the like intentionality of decision making, the thought about sort of how our choices fit into some bigger picture. That's the piece that I think I'm sort of drawing from the firm, not the like, I mean, there are some other tools from the firm, but like not the idea that this is some kind of like profit motive.
Right. And the need for that kind of a decision structure or approach does seem more necessary when you go into domains that just have a lot less clear evidence. And that is one of the things that's kind of notably different about this book than Expecting Better and Crib Sheet, is that you, of course, tackle a number of specific issues, like when to start kindergarten, how to deal with sleep and things like that. But the conclusions are often a little bit more, we're not exactly sure, consider these things. I'm curious to what extent you sort of expected that when you started to look into this, or were you surprised by the relative kind of lack of data that there was on many of these issues?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I think I expected pieces of it and not others. So I think the piece that I expected, that I sort of knew would be true, is that in some of these, that there's just a lot. It's like the causality is really hard. That when we look at a question like how important is family dinner in kids' outcomes, that you would run up against the fact that the families who choose to eat dinner together have the opportunity to eat dinner together every night. That's just like a really different. So that's really different. That's like there's a lot of differences. And I sort of knew that in those spaces, it would be hard to get to kind of get the right data. There are other spaces in the book, and school choice is kind of one of them, where actually in a kind of academic sense, the data is not bad. Like we have like if you asked about sort of data about like charter schools versus like, actually we know a lot about that landscape. Like we have a lot of good, pretty causal evidence on that stuff. But I think the thing I realized and hadn't sort of put together before I started working on the book is even in those spaces, it is not always clear that the data is directly helpful to individual families' choices, because the pieces of evidence you want are so the choices you have are so different, and the treatment effects are likely to be so heterogeneous across kids. So there isn't one answer to like what is the right school for people. It sort of like varies with your kid. And so I think some of the work in the book, and I don't know how successful this always is to say, okay, here's how we know, we know sleep is important, and here's kind of the roughly right amount, but actually doesn't really tell you the answer. But like, here's how you would sort of know if you were giving your kid the right amount. So I think there's a little bit of work to say, like, the data says there's heterogeneity. Here's how you might think about where your family or your kid fits in that heterogeneity. But there are limitations for sure.
Well, why don't we linger for a second
Yeah.
with the school choice question, just to pick an example to kind of illustrate a little bit concretely the framework that you're talking about. What is the sort of state of evidence on school choice, and maybe walk us through your approach of how parents should think about that decision?
So, okay, so I sort of have, in a big decision like that, I have the idea that people should take some structured approach. And I have this particular approach involving what I call the 4Fs. And so the first of those is to say, when you face a choice like this, that you want to start by framing the question. You want to start by thinking concretely about what the choices are, what the actual alternatives are. So sometimes people ask a question, we'll sort of think about the question like, is this, should my kid go to this school or not? And that's not a very helpful way to think about the question, because or not is not a school that I'm aware of, right? And so you kind of need to get to a point where you say, this is the actual choice I have. And part of that is saying, what are the two or three concrete options? Part of it is thinking like, is there really a choice? Sometimes you say, well, actually, like, there isn't really another good, like, there isn't really a choice. Like, this is kind of the choice that I have, and we're going to have to do this. So the sort of first step on that is to just say, what are the two choices? So then there's a second step called fact finding, in which I suggest that people collect some data on and I think data is like a few different pieces. So one piece of the data on schools would be something like, what is like, how good are these schools? They spend a bunch of time in the book talking about, first, what do we know about school types? So like, what do we know about private schools versus public schools? Or what do we know about charters versus public schools? And I think there, when you sort of dig into that, a lot of the answer depends on the quality, like the quality of the alternative. So if you look at something like charter schools, on average, kids perform better on tests as a result of lotterying into charter schools. So there's like some good evidence on that, but it depends a lot on the quality of the alternative, right? So there's a little bit of a piece in there. When you try to dig even more into like, okay, well, what makes a good school? Like, what are the characteristics of a good school? There are a few things that kind of pull out pretty readily. Things like class size, teacher feedback. So there's a sort of a few kind of things that you could point to at schools. But then there's a lot of that kind of fact finding in any space, but particularly in schools, which is about things that are sort of not covered in that kind of data, characteristics of the schools that aren't about test scores, right? So almost all of our data is like, how do we optimize test scores? Well, maybe that's not the main thing you care about. Maybe you care about the diversity of the school. Maybe you care about the sort of other opportunities. Maybe you care about, maybe you just care about the type of school, like whatever it is, like there's sort of a set of other things. And on top of that, there's a whole piece of logistics. So in this kind of fact-finding step, as people think about this, there's a sense in which I want them to also think about, how would my life work if I have these two schools and one of them is an hour away? Like, how are we going to make that operate? Like, let's not just like assume that will work out. Let's actually think about, how is that going to impact other parts of our life? Third step, once you've got all that information, is to make a final decision. And I think that particularly when choices are hard or uncertain, we tend to be very reluctant to pull the trigger. So we tend to be very reluctant to say, like, I'm going to make this decision. And instead we just sort of like make it every day, like in a weird, like sort of every day we kind of like make it, and then we get some information, we make it again. Like, that's not a very good decision frame. It kind of means it's taking up all of the space in your head forever. So this is a way to say, do the work, make the decision, try to move on. And then the fourth F is follow up, and that's just trying to note that in a lot of our decisions, we think of them as permanent. Like, I'm going to choose this school and I'll never reevaluate. And I think that's a mistake. I think in almost all of the choices that we make, there is an opportunity to reevaluate, and that we should plan for that opportunity. We should say at the end of the school year, we're just going to at least have a short conversation to ask, do we want to do the same thing again? Or at the end of the, this soccer season, we're going to say, should we do it again? And that we're not just going to assume that because we did something, like the sort of, we're gonna fight a little bit the hysteresis of kind of doing the same thing every time. So that's it. Those are my 4 steps.
Yeah, and that's something I appreciated about the book in this chapter, was a kind of clarification that the kind of big frame between like public versus private versus charter is just really not a helpful way to even frame the question. And you show some graphs around how some charters are better than some publics seem better than charter, and vice versa, but land with some kind of criteria about schools that as a parent you might try to assess in the particular school set that's in front of you, which is, a fair amount of nuance and, as you noted, effort. But for a big decision like that, it seems worth it.
Yeah, I think sometimes, we're sort of like, well, like I'm going to think about this, like, are private schools better? That question is not helpful for you. It's not well defined. It's like, that's not really a question that as an individual parent we would be particularly able to answer or would be helpful to answer for us. And I think that's kind of, that's important.
So why don't we pick another example? And this one is not in the book, but is under a lot of discussion now. And I know you talked about it some in Parent Data, the newsletter, but with Delta rolling around, there's a lot of
Delta variant. Yeah.
Delta variant. There's a lot of debate and decisions happening on sort of what to do with kids in school, how to do it safely, whether to wear a mask. I kind of want to tee you up again here to maybe illustrate how the approach can help in this setting.
Yeah. Okay, of course. So first, I think this is a good example of something that I've been thinking a lot about in the book, which is, the book is really, and to a large extent my newsletter, is kind of really focused on like, how do you make the best decision as a parent under the constraints that you face, right? And so as a parent, like I look out at the world and I have some schools that I have an option to choose, or I have some particular opportunities about what could I do with my kid this upcoming year in the face of the Delta variant. And I think sometimes our debates are getting like, there's like a separate policy debate, which this is sort of getting wrapped up in, right? And I think that that's making it hard to make a lot of these choices, right? Because I think there's people I hear from a lot who are living in places without mask mandates. And the question is, and they're trying to decide whether to send their kid to school, but also they're consumed with anger. And I totally get that. Like, they're just so mad that the policy is what it is. And I think that's a sort of reasonable reaction, but also not one that's helpful in making your own choice. So sort of with that frame, I would say, when you approach this as a parent, the first thing people want to do is to say, okay, what are the actual choices that I have? And so it may be that for some people, the choice is going to be, should I send my kid in person or should I enroll in a remote option? For some people, the choice is going to be, should I send my kid in person with wearing a mask or not wearing a mask? Should I say, or should I do the remote option? Like, there's a finite number of choices. It may be that you have no choice, right? So there's a set of, for like my kid's school is opening in person. There is not a remote option at their school. My choice is, it's not that I don't have a choice, but the choice is send them in person wearing a mask to school, or homeschooled, like, or some option which basically for me is like completely out of the question. Like, even if I wanted it, even if I was anxious about sending them to school, which I'm not, I would not have another choice. So, and the first step there is to kind of think about the options. And then the second set is really to sort of think about the risks. And this is where I think I've been writing a lot about trying to help people sort of try to think about the size of these risks. And so, people say a lot of things like kids are low risk of COVID. But that is hard for people to understand. And so I try to sort of put some numbers on that and talk about like, what do we mean by that? The hospitalization risks are probably in the same kind of, conditional infection. The hospitalization risks are kind of in the same space as something like the flu, but a bit lower than something like RSV, at least for younger kids. The risks of death are quite a bit lower, probably even than the flu. It's not common, very, very, very rare for healthy kids. And the risk of getting sick at all is probably more like 50%. So I kind of have some summary of like, look, if your kid gets COVID, it's like a 50% chance you probably won't know. And then there's among the rest of the 50%, it's almost it's like a 98% chance or that they will basically just have like pretty mild symptoms, like a sort of typical. And then there are some sort of more tail events. So I'm kind of trying to like put that out for people. But then I think what's hard is like, okay, but what do I do with that? Like, I like how, like you, okay, so it's low risk, but it's not zero risk. It's not like you're saying like that this is something I would like welcome. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's not, and I think that's what's hard for people. And so I'm sort of I've spent much of the last year trying to put together different ways to sort of help people think about these kind of probabilities. And I think the latest one I came to is to say, okay, look, imagine there was no chance your kid would get COVID. Now think about what you would do, right? Like, would you, and I think for some people, actually, it's like, I would take the remote option, even if I thought there was no chance, because I can't handle the idea of this disruption. Like, I just want to know what I'm planning for. I don't think that's a lot of people, but it's not nobody. Or some people's kids love remote school. It's like a different thing. And then I think there's the other side, which is almost think about like, what if there was a very high chance? Like, what if it was like 50%? Like, what if you were sure your kid would get COVID? And I think like that's a hard thing to think about, but like, what if you knew that would happen? Would you send your kid to school? And I think some people are like, you know what? I would do it because like, I see that the risks are low. I see these are the kind of risks I'm taking all the time. And like, even if I knew this would happen, like I would send them because I know school is really important. I think for many other people, they'd be like, definitely not. If I knew that they were going to get COVID, I would figure out something else to do. And so then you sort of dial it down from there. Like, what if there was a 20% chance? Like, because that's a number you can think about. And then when you get into like, well, how risky is actually in-person school? The answer is it's not very risky at all. Like basically there's not much transmission at all in school. They're at much higher risk from household transmission or other, transmission kind of outside the school. So the school itself is not risky, but I think part of what's made it hard for people is that we're kind of saying all these probabilities are small and you're supposed to like multiply them all together. And like, I can't think about small probabilities. And so there's a way to frame this to say, think about a probability you're a little more comfortable. Like 20% is a probability we kind of get. Like we can kind of conceptualize what that means once every week, something, and so I think that some of that is kind of trying to just pull on places where we can think about the numbers a little bit more clearly.
Right. I'm curious to try this analogy on you and see if you might want to rename your book a bit, which is, okay. I was reading it and thinking of the similarities with government, actually. And of course, I do a lot of work with government, so I'm biased here. But, unlike a firm, which, to simplify a bit, but relative to government has sort of a product they're selling, they're monitoring the overall net revenue that they're getting. There's a clear kind of feedback loop. With government, there are many different competing priorities. You're trying to deliver transportation and health and public safety at the same time, highly limited data, tremendous amount of uncertainty about what works, a lot of different stakeholders who have fundamentally different values at stake. And in some cases, in that instance, a well-functioning government is one that has kind of systems for getting people to make decisions that at least enough folks can kind of feel good about and get along about, as opposed to necessarily optimizing end-of-day income, because it's kind of impossible to do that. I'm curious if you find that compelling or what you make of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, there's like, in some sense, like the book is a pitch to like use like deliberate tools from the business world, which is not really all from business, right? So it's not, partly because it's not really about the analogy is not about optimize or profit maximize. It's about deliberateness or intentionality. I think it really is almost like the family, like workplace. And whereas workplace could be, government or whatever. So I think that's kind of I think that's a little, I see the analogy, but I'm not sure that the analogy here is so focused on the firm. And I also think that firms tend to be like better organized, like a little, like they tend to they like row in a little bit more the same direction. And maybe I'm saying that because I spent the last year interacting with government.
Well, but part of what I'm suggesting is that the reason firms can sometimes actually row a little bit clearer is that they have an easier kind of river that they're rowing down. They're trying to sell sneakers or something like that. Whereas in a government,
but that's a sort of, I think that's like a simplistic view. I mean, Amazon is not a firm that like just this is not like, yes, maybe if your firm is like a tiny, is like just trying to do one thing, but Amazon is trying to like run a cloud server and like ship and like train the entire American economy and run 1 billion warehouses. And like, there's like, large firms are doing a million different things. They have a bunch of things that they're trying to do. They're not just trying to sort of optimize around one product. And they're not always just trying to optimize around one particular, like, business area or even one particular outcome, I think.
Mm-hmm. So let's pick another example. You've got a chapter talking about TV and social media use, which maybe that's 2 different examples. What's your kind of read on the state of the evidence here in terms of what parents should be doing?
So I think, in the case of I sort of separate the book a little bit into kind of like the social media side and the passive media side. So like TV, video games. And again, I'm sort of trying to give people like a way to think a little bit about this and separate. I think we tend to think of TV as kind of like one thing, which is like, it's a thing that you do and you sit and you watch and whatever. And so part of what I sort of pitch here is like, TV is actually 2 things. TV is not doing something else and it is content. And so there's a sort of content piece and a like time piece. And so most of what we know, most of what we sort of think about almost as the downsides of TV are actually about the time piece, right? So the evidence around sort of people, the kind of evidence around like content and like what if kids watch violent TV, do they like that stuff is all, that evidence is all very poor. There isn't any particularly good evidence suggesting that if kids watch violence on TV, they become more violent. Like the content is really, I think, not the central thing. The central thing is like if they're watching TV, they're not doing something else. And so that means, they're not exercising, they're not learning to read, they're not like, having a deep philosophy conversation, they're just like watching TV. And so I think sometimes people are like, oh, okay, well, that means they shouldn't watch TV. But I think the right way to frame this is say if your kid told you that for an hour before dinner, 45 minutes or whatever, before dinner every night, they just wanted to sit in their room and they wanted you to stare at the wall. They just wanted to like sit there quietly and stare at the wall. You would be like, that's amazing. Like my kid is such a great meditator and I didn't even have to teach them. They just like, they love meditating and staring at the wall and like, and of course you would also be like, oh, thank God, because I can like make dinner and not have people like totally, freak out on this, right? So, and that would be like yelling at me. So in some ways, I think that it's not like you would never have them stare at the wall. You wouldn't have them stare at the wall for 6 hours a day because then they wouldn't be doing their homework or any of the other things they need to do. So there's like a balance there, but the balance isn't to say you should never have screens. The balance is to say you should think about what is the alternative. And I think particularly during the pandemic, a lot of us use screens a lot more. I think part of the sort of frame of that was like, the alternative is I'm yelling at you. Like the alternative is like not a great situation. And in that situation, watching TV was better than me yelling at you. And, it's true that like it's not exactly meditation, but I'm not sure that like watching, miraculous ladybug animated adventures is really that different from meditation.
Of course, a lot of similarities.
It's very similar.
Yeah. And I'm in reading that, and if somebody that's got a 3 and a 5-year-old, 2 boys, kind of appreciated the perspective that, as you kind of put it, sometimes you need a break, sometimes the kids need a break, and that's preferable to sort of duking it out. The part where I caught myself not wanting to let myself off the hook too quick there was sort of the thought that if I sort of was refusing TV, and now they're getting old enough to where sometimes they're like asking for it, right?
Sure.
Where's the iPad and that kind of stuff. And really the calculus I kind of have in my mind is, if I could just duke it out with them for like 10 minutes and really hold firm, then they will start to go play with blocks or do something else. But it's very tempting to want to just be like, oh, I'm exhausted, as you said. and kind of give in at that moment. And so it's like a little
Yeah,
bit
but
more.
I think that's an argument I think it's an argument for deliberateness, and to say basically, okay, but how, like, let me think in advance. In the moment, you can't make a good decision about that. Like, it's easy to be like, hey, just take the iPad, fine. But there's a moment in when you're not tired to be like, how much of this do we want to be doing? Like, is there a limit? Is there a limit we want to put? Is there a time we want to put on it? Like, how do we want to think about that? And I think that externalizes both for you and for them. Right? Sort of think about when you teach and the syllabus. Think about, like, one of the greatest teaching tricks is to put stuff on the syllabus. And then when people ask for things, to say you can't do it because it's on the syllabus. Like, can I have an extension? I'm so sorry. I wish I could help you. But on the syllabus, it says you can't have extensions. I wrote the effing syllabus. Like, that's like, they're just like, I can do whatever I want. I just make this shit up every day. But I think that, for your kids, it's the same kind of thing. Be like, I'm sorry, I do wish you could watch TV right now, but actually TV time is at this other time. It's not now. And I trust me, I'd like you to watch TV too. But unfortunately, the rules say that TV time is later. And I think I think that kids are I think in general, kids are pretty responsive to that because they understand the idea of rules. And, it takes a little while for them to put together that you make the rules.
Yeah. It is a magical
it's a magical thing.
Exploit well. So thinking about where evidence is really limited or mixed, I'm curious how you kind of weigh up the evidence side when it's kind of limited like that against just the whole body of places where there's traditions, family habits, stories passed down from grandparents and things like that. How do you kind of balance those two? Is it like one study that's well done could knock you off of a family habit type of thing, or do you have a different kind of approach?
I tend to, I think in this, there's a reason that we're drawn to data, I think, which is that we want to make the right choices. That particularly in parenting, we really want to be right. And we feel like data is like a concrete thing to like hang on to, right? Like this is like, even if it's just one study, it's like so concrete. And I think I suffer from that. Like a lot of people, it's sort of like, okay, like, well, there's like one study that should like sort of trump everything. And I think there's a moment of stepping back and being like, look, there's sort of there's this one study, but also there's just general logic, or there's, other aspects of kind of preferences. And I think that there's a space for taking all of that into account, and also for accepting that some of these choices we're going to make are going to be made because we like them, because they're what we want, and that it should be fine to say that, the reason that I have my kid doing competitive hockey 6 nights a week is because like I think that's cool and he likes it and it's fun and we have it, it's like a cool activity that we do together. And in some ways, like that should be enough. You shouldn't have to be like, it's because he's going to be a professional hockey player or because he's going to get to college like that. You shouldn't have to say that, like we should be able to make some of these choices and just say that the reason that we're organizing our life the way that we are is because that's what we want. And I think that's sometimes missed.
I'm struck by, and actually this is the whole point of your framework, and you alluded earlier around how in framing the question, you need to be very cognizant of the constraints and things that you have around you, of even what's a possible choice. You can't go to private school if you can't afford it, for example, or childcare, et cetera. And, it's actually such a big constraint in so many places. I kind of feel like one of your books down the road needs to be about the public policy implications in terms of all the different places where there are constraints on families' decisions that, ideally wouldn't be there. I'm curious.
Yeah.
When is that book's coming out?
You're right. That is like next year. Yeah, 2022.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think in some ways, in almost everything I talk about in the book, or many of the things, there's almost like a parallel discussion about sort of what would be a good policy. So I'll give you a very concrete example, which is redshirting. So, and somebody asked about this in the chat. So, I talk in the book about the question of redshirting, and if for those of you who are not like deeply entrenched in kindergarten age promotion. The issue here is that, for kids who would be relatively young for their grade, who say are a summer birthday when there's the September 1st cutoff for school, sometimes it has become increasingly common over time to hold the kids back for a year to keep them home, and then to send them when they're older. And the idea there is that they will be like bigger and readier and whatever, like readier for school. And when you look at the data, when you sort of dig into like the data on that, the kind of big reason to do that, the advantage of doing that, is that we see kids who are sort of relatively very young for their grade are more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities, with ADHD in particular, sort of hyperactivity. And those diagnoses tend to follow them. It's more of an issue for boys than for girls. And because of the way those studies are run, it seems pretty clear that what's going on is not that those kids have more ADHD, but that it is because they are being compared to older peers, and that a kid who's just turned 5 is really different in their ability to sit still to like an almost 7-year-old. And particularly because kindergarten has become more of like a thing where you sit still and do worksheets, whatever, in a lot of places, that if a kid is young, it's easy to be like, oh, the reason that they're acting out is that they, have this issue, as opposed to that they're young. So from an individual decision maker standpoint, I think that's informative in the sense that it says, the kinds of things that might push you towards doing this rather than sort of doing the default, or if you had a kid who was, kind of a summer birthday, who was less good than like not, who you thought was sort of like not ready for the kind of physical, like focused demands of kindergarten. So that's in the individual decision frame. But I think there's, on top of that, there's a policy thing, which is like, it's crazy that we're making parents make this choice. We should just not have this choice. Like, this shouldn't be a thing you can choose to do, except in very unusual circumstances. And the reason that it shouldn't be a choice, I think, is that it is tremendously unequal. Like, basically the people who have the resources to like have another year of childcare for their kid and not send them to like free school tend to be rich people. They tend to be, so then we're sort of exacerbating already existing inequities in sort of in the world. On top of which, I don't know why it should be the job of parents to decide when to send their kid. On top of which, this pushes kindergarten even more into this kind of like space that probably isn't age appropriate for kids who are that age, which is like sitting down and sitting still and doing worksheets. And like, that's not really good for kids. So there's all kinds of reasons we just shouldn't have this option. And I think that there's a parallel in a lot of these places that kind of, it would be better if policy were organized differently, conditional on how policy is organized. There's a set of choices that, parents may want to make, but actually on the policy side, we should be thinking about how to make it so they don't have that choice. But that's on the book, right. On the next book, or some other book, somebody else's book.
Yeah, and there's policy choices about kind of, just distribution of resources and things like that. And, I did have a note to myself too on how a lot of, you wrote the book kind of helpfully thinking about the individual family unit kind of making the most that it can out of the situation it's in. But a lot of these decisions do have this kind of collective action dimension to it, like the red shirting example of sort of, it's not only the age of your kid, it's the relative age of other kids. When to give your kid a cell phone interplays with when all of their friends are starting to get cell phone. Same with a lot of the kind of competitive feelings that sometimes people get about grades and extracurriculars. Mm-hmm. Is there, short of changing state or federal policy, is there a front of kind of coordinated activity with other families, more involvement on PTAs and Rotary clubs and stuff like that, that people should be thinking about how to get more civically involved for just coordinating with other families?
Yeah, I think that, this is, people differ on this. I think there are a set of people whose view is basically more of the kind of collective approach, which is like, if we all, like, I should do this because if we all did it, things would be better. I tend to think, for me, of these things as sort of parallel. Like, there's a place for advocacy. There's a place for like trying to coordinate, trying to push policy in particular directions, trying to make progress there. And that maybe that like, it's not obvious we're going to be able to make a huge amount of progress with the sort of in some cases you might, but like sort of moving redshirting policy by like coordinating with other people to not redshirt your kid this year, like that's I think I'm a little more skeptical about human nature. Like, I'm just not sure that I think we see too many examples where that the kind of thing just never work. And so I am more in the space of let me push on policy over here and, make choices over here. But I also think for some people, there's a sense in which like part of what they find important is these sort of like alignment with the value, with other values, right? And to say like, it is important, like my value is to support the public school system. And that is, I'm going to send my kid to public school, even if, I am not as sure that that is like the optimal thing for them, because that's part of my values. And I think that's kind of a different thing. That is in some ways a collective, that's a contribution to the collective, but a recognition that it is because of your own preferences.
Are there any family domains that you think it's wiser to not try to kind of strategically map it out or measure it, and instead step back and, for whatever reason, sort of theory is that you'll end up feeling better about that space if you don't try to kind of metric it out in this way?
I think there are many areas where I think I wouldn't push on metrics or data or sort of say, but I think there are fewer in which there are fewer big areas in which I think deliberateness is not of value. So I would sort of separate out like the kind of feel of like, I'm going to make this choice because of some like a data piece. And I think that there's like tons of, I think realistically, almost every choice that I make in my own household actually doesn't really reflect like trying to optimize something in terms of data. It reflects like what are the values and the sort of priorities that we have. Like the one exception is probably sleep, where like really like a lot of our life is organized around a belief that data says that like kids need a lot of sleep. But most of the other stuff I do, I think I wouldn't be like, oh, I do that because of data, because of data. But there are fewer areas in which I would say it's not good to think, fewer major areas in which I would say it's not good to think intentionally about this choice, because I'm not sure what the alternative is. Like I'm, just like doing things in a haphazard. And some people say that, like basically, well, the way I want my family life to work is I want it to just be a lot of chaos, and I don't ever want to know what's coming around the other side. And like, I don't care, I think that like, oh, like that's not how I feel about my life. And I think, but if that's what you want to do, I think you could be intentional about that. You're like, okay, well, I intentionally want to just like never know what's happening tomorrow. Like, okay. But that's a choice. That's an intentional choice.
Right. Yeah. And I don't actually have anything in mind in asking that, other than, so my substantive area is actually in decision making, which is actually all about sort of structures of how to process information. And it is a space where it'll sometimes come up. I've not done it in the parenting setting, but for instance, you shouldn't question physician judgment. If you try to actually like open that box and analyze it too carefully, you somehow, will disrupt the kind of wisdom that would otherwise organically emerge. And I don't know what it is, other than sometimes an intuition that, some things just shouldn't be scientifically analyzed. Not that I could personally make a whole lot of sense of that, but it sometimes can crop up in weird little places.
Yeah. I think again, like it's sort of, some things you're just going to do like almost on instinct, but I think these big, and I would differentiate between sort of like little things and big things. And I think the big things matter more.
Yeah. Well, and in this case, I think one of the parts that would be really liberating about following your sort of structured approach, you hit on a little bit earlier, is how some slow down to make a deliberate decision today can save you from having to revisit that decision over and over again in perhaps more stressful environments. And so in some sense, it's not actually, I know there's been some people who have kind of seen your book and wonder whether you're like putting more effort,
is it more work? Is it more work
on parents? Where I think actually it could lead to less decisions at the end of the road, because you don't have to have that argument about whether there's going to be TV or who's like cooking on Wednesday night, if you just kind of hashed it out earlier.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of like it's moving the work. I think like it, and it is definitely, there are pieces of this that say like sort of up, like I'm suggesting you do some work up front, and there, but I think it will save time or conflict later.
Are there topics that almost just made the book that you had to cut?
Not really. Because I think that we're sort of diving down a space where the data is not always that great. So I think that the things I would have decided I would have felt like I missed, it would have been like, wow, there's like really great data on this question, but like there's no.
Why? I kind of broached this a little bit earlier, but I want to come back to it on why there isn't just more research and evidence on a lot of these questions. It's kind of maddening given how important and influential it is. And, scientists study all kinds of stuff. Like, why don't we actually have more empirical work and more randomized experiments on a lot of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is it's hard to run a randomized experiment on people's behaviors, particularly when there are things people care a lot about. So let me give you an example. So, there's a lot of talk about like how family meal is important and eating together as a family is important. And there's tons of correlational evidence. Like it's hard to find any parenting choice where there's more like good stuff that goes on the left-hand side but of course it's also like tremendously selected. Like the sort of set of people who do this are just like totally different than those who do not. So it's actually like a really hard causality. It's a really hard causality space. Yes. Okay. So there is a randomized control trial where they tried to evaluate this. You say like, okay, we'd like to evaluate. So they basically like encourage people to have a family meal. And the thing that happened is nobody did it. So you're relying on, it's not a drug, where you can basically be like, you're going to take it or not take it. This is like, they told people to have a family meal and nobody had the family meal. Like there was no first stage. And so then there was no second stage, but like, of course there was no second stage. Like there was no first, like there's an effect is like that, but it didn't change anything. And I think that's part of it. Like some of these things, it's hard to generate evidence because it is hard to generate behavior change. And the same is true in things like diet. You'd say like, well, how can we think about what's like the optimal diet for kids, like the healthiest diet, whatever. It is really hard to get people to change their family's diet. So we can sort of sort around the edges with RCTs on some of these questions, but there are some pieces where it's better, but it's just like, I think the behavior change is challenging. And the heterogeneity treatment effect is always really hard in experiments.
I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm still not fully satisfied with like our research community on this because, like, yeah, randomized controlled experiments they're hard to pull off, but they can be pulled off. We've done them on policing issues, on public health issues, things where like literally life and limb is at stake. Yeah. And so, even with something like meals, totally get your point about whether you can actually get the behavior change there. But, my mind wants to go to thinking about how to solve that. Like, I don't know, let's get a budget and just like deliver people the family meal so that it's not the cooking burden, so that we can really help them get at the dinner table. So that's not the obstacle. And it just seems like there's a lack of creative push sometimes to be doing more experiments.
Yeah, but I think that's fair. I think that's a fair point.
Right. Well, all of the researchers who are listening to
this, go do that.
Please do
that. Deliver people meals.
To go do some of these things. Here's there's a particular one I was curious about is whether you came across anything in the domain of like toys. There's a lot of stuff out there about, should you have natural toys, other stuff? Do you have too many, too little, anything?
Listen, here's what I would say about this, David. And I think this is an answer to many questions. If you were thinking about what is the right kind of toy for your kid, it's fine. Your kid's fine. It's the same when people are like, there's these two preschools. One of them has all the teachers have master's degrees, but in the other one, only one of the teachers has a master's degree, but it's in early childhood education. And like, how should I think about that? It's like, don't think about it. Go with the one that's closest to your house and is more convenient, or that you like the backyard. Like, and I think this kind of gets this whole point. Like a lot of these things, we're like, it's like, that's not important. Like there are big picture things that, may be important. And we know that it's like in general, there are differences in outcomes for kids, but questions like, what is the right kind of wooden toy? No, don't think about that.
This might be motivated by my desire to just have fewer toys.
Right, sure. If you want to have, but that's the thing. If you want to have fewer toys, but you're like, you know what? I'm going to have fewer toys because I don't like having so many toys. I hurt my toe. That's a good reason. I stepped on a toy. That's it. I stepped on a Lego. Throw the Legos. Put the Legos away. Yeah. That's it.
I'm gonna go back to my.
That's because of my foot.
Yeah, my
That's why.
parenting syllabus that I'm going to create is going to have a new
Exactly.
section
I'm
on
so
toy
sorry.
Legos stepping on. Well,
So
so
sorry.
as we've been chatting, I've been pulling some questions
Yeah.
from the audience, but let me go explicitly to a few and give folks a explicit prompt that if you haven't tossed your question in yet, please do it. We've got a few more minutes left here. And here's one coming from Alice asking what you think about the data from books like Coddling the American Mind that said kids lacking independent free play without supervision is bad.
I mean, I actually like that book a lot. I think that there's sort of two pieces of what they're saying. One is like kids need to play outside and have unsupervised play. I think the other piece is about sort of some kind of independence and sort of scaffolding independence as a skill or as something that we don't do as much of. And I think that I sort of spent some time in the book on these kind of parenting philosophies. And in particular, thinking about the sort of like kind of, not to put you fine a point on it, but like the kind of helicopter versus free range chicken kind of thing, where it's like, are you going to, how much are you scaffolding your kids and how much are you sort of letting them go? And that has a physical component, but it also has a sort of like how much are you going to make them responsible for things and let them to live with the consequences of that? And I think when we look into the data on that, there seems to be, there's probably some sort of like in everything else, some kind of like happy medium, where it's certainly the case that in many ways more involved parenting delivers better outcomes. Kids who are read to do better kind of stuff. But there's also a sort of flip side of that where, kids who are like in college who perceive their parents to be sort of overly involved are more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression and so on. And so I think that there's clearly some kind of sense in which you both do not want to like abandon we want to be able to make sure that our kids know that we are like, that there's there's a support, but simultaneously not send them off to college like having never like made an omelet or never like put a piece of bread in the toaster, because eventually they like have to be an adult. And I think that's the thing I took away from the Coddling of the American Mind, is the idea that like there's a kind of amount of independence we want to deliver to our kids. And I think that is somewhat supported in the data. And, the one thing I would say very practically to Alice is that there are, as a person also with a tremendously structured life, is that you may need to look outside of your structured life for structures to deliver unstructured time. And so in particular, I think this is what people like about camp, about something like some kind of like out of like, if it's an option, some kind of like sleepaway kind of camp where kids basically their time is just inherently less. The structure is you're sending them somewhere on purpose to have less structured time and to sort of figure things more out for themselves. Because I think it's not just that their time is structured. It's like when they're at school, every social interaction is, or many social interactions are like also really scaffolded. And, there's not a lot of just like do whatever and, throw balls at each other as hard as you can until somebody cries, which was like my entire childhood. It was like, you just go to some parking lot and like everybody throws balls really hard at each other until somebody goes, I'm crying. And like, that was it. And your mom was like, I guess you're the person who get hit by the balls today. All right.
Yeah. And that very rarely happens to you nowadays.
No, you don't see that much. That's what Twitter's for.
Right. It is interesting how a lot of the things you talk about seem applicable to us as parents and adults, which I guess would be expected as they're getting kind of older. But a lot of your recommendations around getting enough sleep,
don't watch TV before
iPad
bed
right beforehand, the benefits of some unstructured time, like all of these things are places that as I was reading the book, I was like, we should do more of that too. We should do more of that too.
I know. Yeah, I know. I watch TV before. I like this whole thing. I was like, at the end of the chapter about sleep is like the most important thing is don't watch screens before sleep. It's like, that's the only time I watch TV.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, do as I say, not as I do.
And that is a place where to pick just one factoid that hopefully people will get to when they read the book, like the quantity of sleep that kids need
is a lot.
Is way more than your intuition. Might be.
And I think so. It's for elementary school kids, it's something like probably 9 to 11 hours typically. Although kids kind of there's a pretty big. I mean, that is itself a big range. There's even a bigger range. But I think for me, the most valuable piece of that kind of analysis was actually like thinking about how would you know if your kid was getting enough sleep. And I think the answer is basically, are they sleepy? Are they do they seem sleepy? And also do they oversleep on the weekend? So if you let them sleep in, would they go 2 extra hours? In which case, they're not sleeping enough. Basically, if you are a well-rested person, you should basically be getting up at the same, roughly the same time, even if you did not set an alarm. And I think that feels like a sort of place where pretty quick self-experimentation might help.
Well, we're about to be out of time. I don't know if there's anything you were really hoping to
No,
chat
this is
about or
great.
ask about that we haven't hit.
No, this is great. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, me too. And I'll put it up. If you haven't already gotten The Family Firm, you absolutely should. It's a great book. I'd also encourage you, like I said at the onset, go check us out at thepolicylab.brown.edu. Maybe also check out the 30,000leagues.com podcast, where actually Emily was one of the first guests that I had, where we talked about your prior book, Crib Sheet. So you can just plug in the earphones and listen to Emily and I chat for many hours.
More podcasting. It's the best.
That's right. All right. Well,
All
Emily,
right. Thanks so much, David.
So much. Thanks, everybody in the audience. It's great to see you.
Thanks, everybody.
See you later. Bye, y'all.
Okay.
Thanks for taking a deep dive with 30,000 Leagues. This podcast was hosted by David Yoakum, Director of the Policy Lab at Brown University, and produced by Kelly Harris Crawley and David Yoakum. You can find more conversations at 30,000leagues.com or by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. Keep safe, keep calm, and narwhal on.
What's the picture behind you?
Oh, this is
Penelope and
I don't know. That was Penelope. That's something from Finn. I'm trying to somebody told me the other day that my wall looks like I'm in a prison. So I tried to clean my office and put some stuff up that made it look like a little less prison-like.
Yeah. I got a lot of the same shit, which is why I put some stuff on the floor. Now people give me grief that it's not actually hung up. Just can't satisfy people.